This is chapter 26. It deals with the fluids, electrolytes, and acid-base balance that we see in the human body. Why is this so important? Because you have to understand the effects of maintaining proper balance for overall homeostasis. If, say, the acid-base balance gets upset, the body's going to do certain changes to try to bring it back into normal ranges. If that is not possible, you can end up in very severe, possibly even death situations. So it's important that you understand how to treat your patient properly to maintain the proper balance of electrolytes, maintain the proper amount of fluid so you don't go into shock, maintain that acid-base balance. When we first got the divisions of fluid in the body, number one, depending on the sex, depending on the age of an individual, there are differences in the amount of water. Yes, you are made up mostly of water. Age does play a role. Infants are about 73% or more water because there's very low body fat, there's very low bone mass. Adult males are roughly about 60% water. Adult females are less than that. They're about 50% water. They tend to have a higher fat content than males do and less skeletal muscle mass. As you age, the water content is going to decline even further. How do we categorize the fluid? Where is it, etc.? Well, first we divide it as being intracellular fluid, ICF, or extracellular fluid, which is ECF. Intracellular fluid means it's the fluid that is inside the cell, and this accounts for about 2/3 of the total volume. The ECF, or extracellular fluid, is outside the cell, and this can be even further subdivided into two components, either the plasma or what we call the interstitial fluid. The interstitial fluid, this would be the space between the cells. It would also include things such as the lymph, your cerebrospinal fluid, synovial fluid, anything that's basically outside the cell but not in the blood. And this is just a diagram showing visually kind of the breakup of the total body water. Once again, most of it's going to be inside the cell in that intracellular fluid. For the extracellular fluid, the majority of that is going to be between the cells, which once again is known as your interstitial fluid. The water is a universal solvent. That means a lot of things can be dissolved in it. The solute is what is dissolved in the water. Those solutes can either be electrolytes or non-electrolytes. Non-electrolytes are usually organic molecules. Things like glucose, lipids. When they are put in the water, they are not going to have a charge to them. Electrolytes will dissociate and have a charge to them when they're placed in water, so we call them ions. You put sodium chloride, NaCl, into water, table salt, and it will dissociate. You will have the sodium ion and the chlorine ion, and they're called ions because they have charges. The sodium will have a positive charge, the chlorine will have a negative charge. These ions can actually conduct an electrical current. This is why you can hook up things like EKG and put the probes just on the surface of the body and still pick up those electrical currents. The electrolyte concentrations, you can measure that. Like I said, you could hook up equipment and measure it. This diagram hopefully will bring back some memories from AMP1. It is showing you 4 different ions where they're under normal conditions located in the body, in which of the fluids. The red is blood plasma, the blue is interstitial fluid, and the yellow is intracellular fluid. So if you look first at, say, sodium, remember, covered this initially in A&P1 when you're talking about muscle contractions. Sodium is typically found very high concentrations in the blood plasma and in the interstitial fluid. It is not inside the cell, or very low amounts comparatively are in the intracellular fluid. Potassium is the reverse. Remember, it's normally found inside the cell, so its concentration would be much higher in the intracellular fluid, but not in the blood plasma or not in the interstitial fluid. It's much lower there. Chlorine ion tends to follow sodium, so you see similarly that the concentrations tend to be high in the blood plasma and interstitial fluid and those extracellular fluids, but low in the intracellular fluid. In terms of pressure, both osmotic pressure, which is dealing with the pressure of the water, and the hydrostatic pressures, these will play a role as to what direction things are moving and how well things are mixed in fluids. If the extracellular fluid osmolarity, that concentration, that pressure of it is increased, water is going to leave the cell. And decreased extracellular osmolarity, water tends to enter the cell. What happens oftentimes in the capillary towards the arterial end at the beginning of that capillary bed, remember, fluid can leak out. Now, it should be reabsorbed as you get towards the venule end, towards the end of that capillary bed. Not all of the fluid will be reabsorbed. The lymphatic system is going to pick up that remaining fluid, and it goes through the lymphatic vessels and eventually ends up back in the blood. This is under normal conditions. Now, ions can move selectively in or out of the cell, and water can move different directions depending on what's going on. Now, most of your nutrients, your waste products, your gases will only be flowing in one direction. So on this table, you can see at the top, let's look at the lungs. You have, with the lungs, you know oxygen is flowing out of the lungs into the blood. From the blood and the interstitial fluid, the oxygen flows out of the blood into the interstitial fluid and then eventually into the cell so that it will be dissolved in the intracellular fluid. Carbon dioxide is going to be flowing the opposite direction. It's produced as a waste byproduct, and it moves out of the cell, out of that intracellular fluid, into the interstitial fluid. Once again, that's the fluid between the cells. From there, it will move into the blood and be carried back to the lungs. Nutrients, instead, are going to be moving out of the stomach. You'd also see this with the small intestines, into the blood, into the interstitial fluid, and then into the cell. Water, depending on the circumstances at that particular location, at that particular time, it can move in either direction, from the stomach to the blood, interstitial fluid into the cell, or vice versa. Same thing with the kidney. Water can go either way. Your nitrogenous waste products from the cell will move out of the cell into the interstitial fluid, into the blood, and from there into the kidneys for producing, and will be released in the urine. Your water intake under healthy, normal conditions, and to maintain those healthy conditions, needs to equal pretty much the water output. So what's going in equals what's going out. Otherwise, you get out of balance and there's going to be problems. On average, we're talking 2,500 milliliters per day. That's roughly 2.5 liters. How do you get the water intake? Well, most of that's going to be ingested. Not only just drinking water, drinking anything that's water-based, and also from the foods that you ingest. Foods often have a high percentage of water in them as well. There will be some water that is produced as a byproduct from different metabolic processes. Water output, most of this is going to be your urine. Some of it, however, will also be lost, what we call insensible water loss. This is through the skin and through the lungs, but also through the feces and perspiration. You need to maintain osmolarity at a fairly constant rate. If it goes up, it's going to stimulate thirst. It's going to stimulate the release of antidiuretic hormone. If there is a decrease in it, it's going to basically cause inhibitory effects. You're not going to want to drink. It's going to also inhibit the antidiuretic hormone, stimulating increased urine production. This is just a diagram showing the average intake of water per day and the average output. So your thirst mechanism is going to play a role in influencing the amount of water you take in. And a lot of this is controlled by the hypothalamus. Remember, hypothalamus is very important overall for helping to maintain the homeostasis in the body. And there are regulators that in the hypothalamus that are going to be activated by things such as a dry mouth. If you have decreased blood volume or decreased blood pressure, that would stimulate you to increase the amount of water. Drinking of water is going to inhibit this thirst system. It's an inhibitory feedback mechanism. You've relieved that dry mouth so you don't have to drink as much. Also, as the stomach starts to stretch, as the intestines stretches, as you have either eaten or taken in water or whatever liquid substance, that stretching of the stretch receptors will send a message then basically to inhibit the thirst system. So you can see in this diagram, and you're going to see several of these throughout this chapter, of how everything interacts with each other. You have decreased saliva, that's going to trigger a dry mouth. That's going to send a signal to the hypothalamus to say, okay, we're getting thirsty. You get that sensation of thirst. So you drink something, the water is going to help moisten the mouth. As you swallow the water, it goes in the stomach starts to stretch a bit, then that's going to then turn around and inhibit the thirst system. There is some water loss that you can't shut down. It's going to happen no matter what, which is why you can't live very long without water. Some of that is that insensible water loss that occurs via respiration, through the skin, through the feces. And then you also are going to be losing water basically from the urine. The volume of urine that's excreted is going to be regulated and dependent on how much fluid intake you have. The concentration of that urine is going to be dependent on the fluid intake, the solutes, your diet. Are you losing water elsewhere? So all of this is tightly regulated and controlled. What's going to happen with the antidiuretic hormone? The water reabsorption in your collecting ducts is proportional to the amount of the ADH that's being released. So if there's decreased ADH, antidiuretic hormone, released, those levels go down, you think of it, a diuretic increases the amount of urine. So if this is an antidiuretic, what happens if it's decreased? It leads to more increased urine production. It's going to have more water in it, so it's going to dilute that urine. If you are then increasing the amount of urine, how do you increase the urine? You put more water in it. That's why it's diluted. If you're putting more water in the urine, then that means where's a lot of that water coming from? From the other body fluids. So you're going to have a decrease in the volume of the other body fluids. The reverse is true if you have an increased ADA levels. What's going to happen is as that hormone levels increase, it's going to say, okay, wait a minute. We don't want to have as much water loss. We need to keep it in the body. So don't put the water in the urine. Reabsorb as much water as possible. Put that, where's the water going to go? You're going to use that to increase the volume of the body fluids. Essentially, what you're doing is you're taking that water out of the urine, putting it and keeping it in the body. Some of it may go in the blood, some of it may go in the interstitial fluid, wherever it's needed. And so the urine becomes much more concentrated because you took more water out of it. There are osmolar receptors in the hypothalamus that can pick up the concentration of the solute, things that are dissolved in water in the extracellular fluid, and then accordingly they will regulate how much of the ADH is being produced. Do you need to increase it? Do you need to decrease it? There are some other factors that can influence the amount of the ADH release. If you have a big change in blood volume or blood pressure, if you have a huge decrease in blood pressure, then what that's going to do, blood pressure is going down. You need to get it up. What do you need to do? Increase ADH release. Now, why do you have a decrease in blood volume? It can be caused by several different things. Maybe you have a lot of sweating. Maybe you're vomiting or diarrhea. Maybe there's been an injury and there's significant blood loss, a prolonged fever. All these various things can cause decrease in blood pressure, decrease in blood volume. And remember, blood volume, you want to keep that fairly constant. So if it's decreasing, you need to increase it to keep it up in that constant level. How do you increase it? Put water in there. How do you get water in the blood? Take it from the kidneys. So the antidiuretic, don't put the water in production of urine, put it back in the blood. And this is showing an example of what will happen when the ADH is released. What are some disorders of water imbalance? Dehydration. Extracellular fluid loss can be due to if there's hemorrhaging, if you have severe burns, you often have to watch for dehydration. Once again, if someone is sick, regardless of what the cause is, if there's prolonged vomiting, diarrhea, fever, so you have profuse sweating, water deprivation, all of that can lead to severe extracellular fluid water loss. What are some of the signs and symptoms of dehydration? Oftentimes people describe having kind of a cottony mouth. There's decreased saliva and you feel that your tongue is really thick and it might be kind of hard to talk. You have increased thirst. You might have dry, flushed skin. One thing with babies, sign for dehydration is if an infant is crying but there are no tears. What can dehydration lead to? It can lead to weight loss, fever, severe cases, mental confusion, can lead to shock. Often what is happening during dehydration, you have this excessive loss of water from the extracellular fluid. That's going to trigger an increase in osmotic pressure. As the osmotic pressure in the extracellular fluid increases, then cells tend to lose water. It flows from the cell into the extracellular fluid, trying to replenish that, and the result is the cells start to shrink. Hypotonic dehydration. This is due to what's known as cellular overhydration or oftentimes just water intoxication. If the kidneys are not functioning properly or if there is a rapid, huge ingestion of water, this water intoxication can occur. In this case, what's happening is you have a lot of water going into the tissue cells and the cells will swell up. In this case, symptoms include nausea, vomiting, muscle cramping. You often have huge disturbances in the metabolic processes that are occurring on, and this can lead to death. This can be treated with hypertonic saline ingestion. So this is showing what's happening as you have this extracellular fluid increase of water, and then that's going to cause a decrease in the osmotic pressure in the extracellular fluid, which then triggers water to move into the cell, and the cells swell. Another type of water disorder is edema. What happens here is there's an abnormal increase in accumulation of the interstitial fluid. So the cell is not swelling, but the tissue is. This can cause problems with diffusion of oxygen and nutrients from the blood into the cells because there's increased distance that they have to travel from the blood capillaries in order to get to the cell because of this extra fluid. What can cause this? Well, you can have increased flow of fluid out of the blood as it goes in the capillary bed and decreasing the amount of fluid to return. So more is leaving than being able to return to the blood. Where does that extra fluid go? It's going to build up in the tissue, and you're going to see it as swelling. Electrolyte imbalances. Remember the electrolytes? These are those ions, they dissociate in water and form a charge. Usually we're talking about salts. It can include other things like acid, bases, and proteins, but we usually look at it in terms of salts. Salts can influence the movement of fluids. It can play a role with the permeability of the membrane, what's allowed in, what's not. How do you get the salts? Usually by ingestion, and then they're lost oftentimes by perspiration in the urine, feces, and vomit. The major electrolytes that we're looking at on this chart are shown: sodium, potassium, phosphate, and it's showing the abnormal conditions, too much versus too little, what the causes can be, what some of the consequences can be. So this is a good chart to look at. And then it continues on with chloride, calcium, and magnesium. If there is a severe deficiency in electrolytes, it can cause cravings for salty foods or maybe sour foods. Pica is one that some people may or may not have heard of. It's a disorder. People who have this tend to want to eat substances that normally most of us don't eat, like chalk or clay. It's usually caused by a deficiency of iron. Sodium, we're going to look at a couple of the electrolytes. Sodium is the most abundant cation. A cation is a positively charged ion that is found in the extracellular fluid. It is a significant player in determining what that osmotic pressure is going to be. And why is this important? Because it helps to control the volume of the extracellular fluid. Water tends to follow salt. So if it moves into the cell, water is going to follow it. If salt's moving out of the cell, water is going to follow it. So if you change levels of, say, the sodium and water's following it, then you could change the plasma volume. You could change blood volume. If you change plasma volume, that's going to affect the blood pressure. Now, sodium is usually in the chart you saw at the very beginning, is usually higher concentration outside the cell. So it's normally very high in the plasma, very high in the extracellular fluid in that interstitial area. It is inside the cell in the intracellular fluid, however, not nearly as high a concentration. Some of the sodium will leak into the cells. There are ion gates that allows it to leak in, but it is going to be pumped out. Remember the sodium-potassium pump? It's back. Here we go. It's pumping that sodium out. Remember, the sodium-potassium pump is pumping 2 potassiums in, 3 sodiums out. So it's pumping it out against that electrochemical gradient that's going to cost energy, but it has to for survival for you. So the concentration of sodium, it's going to play a role in determining the pressures of the extracellular fluid. And if you remember, it does play a huge role in the stimulation, the excitability of neurons and muscles. The total body content of sodium helps to determine the extracellular fluid volume, and so it does play a huge role with blood pressure, as shown here in this table for the sodium concentration and the sodium content, how it's monitored, where, etc. So any changes in blood pressure, any changes in blood volume will trigger additional kind of a cascade event of changes, both hormonal and neural, that will regulate the sodium levels. Aldosterone is going to play a large role in regulation of the sodium in the kidneys. Normally, about 65% of the sodium is going to be reabsorbed in the proximal tubule. So remember, filtration occurred in the glomerulus. So it was drawn out of the blood. About 65% of it gets reabsorbed initially in that proximal tubule, and then about 25% in the nephron loop, that loop of Henle. Sodium is not going to be secreted at this point into the filtrate. When aldosterone concentrations are high, then the sodium is going to be reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubules. Water is going to follow sodium, as I said a bit ago. So if water is going to follow, remember reabsorption in the collecting tubules and the distal convoluted tubule, if something's being reabsorbed, like the sodium, it means you're putting it back in the blood. If water follows that, then that means you are going to be increasing the amount of volume in the blood, which the plasma is part of the extracellular fluid. So that volume overall is going to increase. When the aldosterone concentrations are low, you're not reabsorbing the sodium, so it stays in the tubules and is going to be released in the urine. Well, if water follows sodium, that means there's going to be more water, so you have increased urine output, which has sodium in it. The renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism is one of your main triggers for the release of aldosterone, and the cells are going to be stimulated by the nervous system. It's one of the main stimuli for it. So this is time how, okay, so aldosterone is regulating the amount of sodium, whether it's being reabsorbed or not, which has an influence of water flowing in. How is aldosterone being regulated? It is going to oftentimes be increased release is going to be triggered by elevated potassium levels. So you start to see how everything is related to each other. And there's often, once again, kind of this cascading effect. So potassium, elevated potassium can trigger increased release of aldosterone, which is going to trigger increased reabsorption of sodium, and that's going to trigger increased reabsorption of water. Now, the response is slow. So it's not something that's going to happen within a few seconds or minutes. It can even take up to days. So this is showing in this diagram some of the different mechanisms and then the consequences of release of aldosterone. So someone who has Addison's disease, they do not produce aldosterone. So if they're not producing aldosterone, that means they're losing an awful lot of sodium chloride and water in urine. If they're losing a lot of water, that means that could lead to low blood volume. How do they account or prevent problems from this? They need to make sure they are always taking in proper amounts of salt and fluids so they don't end up with an imbalance. You're losing a lot, you need to replenish that. Another type of regulating or controlling the sodium balance has to do with atrial natriuretic peptide, NAP. This is released by cells in response to stretching, which is caused by increased blood pressure. So what is it going to do? Well, it's going to trigger the release. So if it's caused by increased blood pressure, it helps to decrease that blood pressure, decrease that blood volume down. How are you going to decrease blood volume? Well, one thing it can do is inhibit ADH, inhibit renin, inhibit aldosterone. All of this is going to mean, if you're inhibiting those, that means you are not going to be reabsorbing the sodium in water, so you're excreting it and losing that blood volume that way. And this shows the various consequences of that. Other hormones can play a role in the regulation of sodium. Females, estrogen, progesterone can play a role in the amount of water retention versus water loss. Estrogen tends to increase sodium reabsorption and leads to water retention. This is why we often see this. As estrogen levels increase in the menstrual cycle, you tend to have the increased water retention. Progesterone does the reverse. It tends to promote water loss. Glucocorticoids can also increase sodium reabsorption. There are baroreceptors associated with the cardiovascular system that can also send stimulus to the brain of increase in blood volume, increase in blood pressure. And there will be subsequent responses to that. If it's increasing blood pressure, increasing blood volume, it tends to increase the amount of sodium and water output to reduce the pressure, reduce the volume in the blood. So once again, showing the interactions between, certainly you're seeing it's not just one component that's regulating, say, blood volume. You see the interactions between the release of several different hormones and how they all have to work together to maintain that homeostasis. Potassium is also going to play a role. I say sodium is the number one, but potassium also plays a role. Now, you have to maintain the balance. Potassium plays a role with the resting membrane potential. Remember, we talked about these previously with neurons and the muscle cells. The resting membrane potential usually has a negative millivolt. Potassium is normally high inside the cell, low in that extracellular fluid. If you increase the potassium concentration in the extracellular fluid, you tend to cause a decrease in that resting membrane potential. It becomes more positive. This is causing a depolarization. If you have a decrease of potassium in the extracellular fluid, it does the reverse. It tends to cause hyperpolarization and leads to more increased chance of non-responsiveness. If you disrupt the concentration of potassium too much with the heart, this is once again dealing with hyperpolarization, depolarization, which is going to be dealing with inhibition or stimulus of the muscle to contract. So you're interfering with that conduction. It can lead to sudden death if you're talking about with the cardiac muscle. Potassium is also part of the body's buffering system. A buffer helps to reduce sudden changes in pH. If the extracellular fluid potassium levels, they tend to rise with acidosis, meaning the pH is lowering. And if extracellular fluid potassium levels fall, you tend to see that with alkalosis, which is an increase in the pH. The distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts, this is where you're going to see a lot of the control for the potassium levels. If high potassium levels or concentrations are in the extracellular fluid, you tend to see the secretion of potassium. Lower levels, you tend to reduce the amount of secretion. Secretion, remember, is flowing at the site of your DCT and collecting ducts. Secretion is where you're taking out of the blood and putting it into the formation of the urine. A lot of the potassium is lost in the urine. This can lead to deficiency levels if it's not replaced in the diet. One important factor with secretion is what's the concentration in that extracellular fluid. If you have a high potassium diet, you have increased potassium concentrations in the extracellular fluid. And so levels get too high, you're going to want to secrete more. If you have low potassium diet, then you're going to want to reduce the secretion of it. Aldosterone does stimulate potassium secretion. So this hormone, once again, plays a role not only with sodium, but also with potassium. They're going to work together. It is going to be regulated by a feedback regulation of the aldosterone. Most of the calcium in the body is going to be found in the bones in that extracellular matrix with those calcium phosphate salts. The calcium levels are also, as always, going to be tightly regulated, and the balance of it is going to be controlled by your parathyroid hormone, the PTH. It's closely monitored. If levels are high, if you need to increase levels basically in the blood, so the levels are low, you want to increase those levels. In the bones, the osteoclasts, which are responsible for breaking down that matrix, they will become stimulated so that they break down that matrix and release that calcium, but it's also going to release phosphate into the blood. The kidneys are going to be stimulated to reabsorb calcium. And then in the small intestines, it's going to be stimulated to absorb more calcium from whatever nutrients you have ingested. Now, it's also going to involve vitamin D. It's very hard to absorb calcium in the small intestines, so you need to have vitamin D in order to absorb the calcium. Which, by the way, is why a lot of your dairy products that have calcium in them also contain vitamin D, because you could ingest the calcium, but without vitamin D, you're not going to be able to absorb it in the small intestines. Most of your calcium is going to be reabsorbed due to the parathyroid hormone. If the calcium levels in your extracellular fluid are normal, then the PTH is inhibited. And once again, here's a diagram showing the effects of the parathyroid hormone and the role that it's going to have, or effects that it will have on the bone, the kidneys, and the intestines to try to increase the amount of calcium in the blood. So why is calcium so important to have that in the extracellular fluid? It's very important for blood clotting. It's important in helping to regulate the permeability of the cell membrane, what can move in, what can move out, and also in the ultimately muscle contractions with the neuromuscular, number one, neuromuscular junction. It is the influx of calcium that that triggers the release of the vesicles across the neuromuscular junction that's going to then stimulate the process on the muscle for muscle contraction to occur. Hypocalcemia can lead to muscle tetany, and then hypercalcemia inhibits the neurons and can cause heart arrhythmias. So hopefully you're starting to see the importance from a nutritional standpoint, certainly, of why it's important to watch the intake of some of these ions: sodium, potassium, calcium. Obviously, we need to have these, but you don't want to have excessive amounts in the diet. That can cause problems, especially if there's already an underlying medical condition that oftentimes you need to really watch. And like I say, sodium is a large one to really watch the intake of that. Chlorine is an anion, meaning it's a negatively charged ion, and it often follows sodium. So they're often linked together. It is normally high in the extracellular fluid. When acidosis occurs, fewer chlorine ions are going to be reabsorbed. Main thing is it's usually tied to the sodium. pH. pH is going to be very closely regulated because it's going to have a huge effect on your proteins. Proteins are highly susceptible to changes in pH. You can often change the pH either up or down, and that will have an effect on the structure of the proteins. It will denature it, meaning it changes the structure. Structure determines function, remember, so if you change the structure, you change the function. Oftentimes, meaning you've destroyed now, the protein is no longer functional. For various biochemical reactions to occur, it is very dependent on maintaining a certain pH as well. Oftentimes, because biochemical reactions are dependent or will only occur certain enzymes that will act as a catalyst to speed up those reactions. Most catalysts or enzymes are proteins, so they are, once again, very susceptible to pH. So it's going to be very, very closely monitored in the body. Normal pH in the body, it depends on where you're looking. Arterial blood is normally maintained right at 7.4. In the interstitial fluid in the venous blood, it's a little slightly lower, 7.35. In the intracellular fluid, it is going to be pH of 7. If the arterial pH is above 7.45, then you have alkalosis. If it is below 7.35, it is acidosis. So, and you end up, or can lead into very serious problems very quickly if you end up in acidosis or alkalosis. So you can see it needs to be between 7.35 and 7.45 in that arterial blood. Adjustments will be made otherwise. Now, sometimes food might be slightly acidic depending on what you're eating. Most of the hydrogen ion is released when the higher concentration of hydrogen ion is present. That is an acid. Most of that's going to be produced as a byproduct of these various metabolic reactions that are occurring. There's different types of acids that can be produced, once again, depending on what you're eating, depending on the process that's occurring. Some of you may be familiar with lactic acid that's formed during anaerobic respiration of glucose. It's broken down to lactic acid, and that's that burning feeling that you feel through extensive hard exercise. Hydrogen ion, remember, from the respiratory system, is also released when carbon dioxide is converted to bicarbonate ion in the blood. There are different ways of regulating the concentration of these hydrogen ions, in other words, dealing with this acid-base balance. There are different chemical buffering systems. This is usually very rapid, be the first thing that you can adjust. You also have the respiratory centers in the brainstem that connect within a few minutes, and then you also can control pH by the kidneys. Um, this is a slower type of response, but it's a stronger response. Oftentimes, people will talk about strong acids, strong bases, weak bases. It has to do with strong acids and strong bases. Do they completely dissociate into the various ions and have a much larger effect on the change of the pH? Weak acids and weak bases will dissociate much slower, only partially, and not have as strong of a change in the pH initially. So this is just showing here on the diagram on the right. In A, you have a strong acid, hydrochloric acid, which you place into the solution, and immediately all the hydrogen dissociates into the hydrogen ions. So none of it remains as HCl. In B, a weak acid, you put it into the water, and not all of it will dissociate. Only some of it does, but not all of it. So you wouldn't see as drastic a change in the pH in that overall solution. So a buffer is something that resists the changes in the pH when you add a strong acid or a strong base. And in the body, in any living organism, when you're going to have different things occur where there may be a strong acid or a strong base produced, and you don't want these sudden rapid changes in pH. You don't want the pH spiking and then falling and then spiking. You want it to remain fairly constant. So there's actually, within the human body, there's three main buffering systems to try to help keep the pH to remain within this healthy range of 7.35, 7.45 in the arterial pH. The three main buffering systems are the bicarbonate buffer system, the phosphate buffer system, and the protein buffer system. Bicarbonate buffering system has to do with bicarbonate and carbonic acid. Now, basically, just know that bicarbonate, HCO3, is going to be very closely regulated in the kidneys. The pH, if a strong base is added, it's going to cause carbonic acid to dissociate. As you can see in the reaction, it releases the hydrogen ion, but the pH is only going to rise slightly. The phosphate buffering system is similar. It's more effective in working with urine and your intracellular fluid where phosphate concentrations are high, where you can have components, sodium salts, combine and form weak acid, weak bases. As you can see here where the sodium has bound. The protein buffer system deals with intracellular proteins that can act as buffers. Some plasma proteins can also be involved. Now, how are the respiratory and the renal systems involved with helping to act as buffering systems from a physiological standpoint? They're going to act a little bit slower than the chemical buffering systems, but they will have a stronger effect. The respiratory system obviously eliminates carbon dioxide. And there's a reaction in the blood, as you know, that the carbon dioxide is carried as initially as carbonic acid, must be carried as bicarbonate, and then is released as CO2. So this reaction shifts from left to right depending on whether you are adding the carbon dioxide or releasing it. Basically, what's going to happen is that if the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood starts to rise. It does activate certain receptors, and it's going to cause an increase in the respiratory rate and how deep you're breathing. The increased hydrogen ions in the blood, which is acidosis, also will activate chemoreceptors, which will increase the respiratory rate and depth. Both of these are moving carbon dioxide out of the blood, which, if it's moving it out of the blood, it is going to reduce the hydrogen ion concentration. So in other words, when the hydrogen ion concentration in the blood is increasing, that is leading towards acidosis. It means the pH is dropping, because increased hydrogen ion is a decrease in the pH. It's becoming more acidic, so that's why we call it acidosis. So what is the response? Increase respiratory rate, increase the depth, get rid of the CO2 that's in the blood, because when you get rid of the CO2, which is bound as bicarbonate, you are getting rid of that hydrogen ion. Alkalosis, which is the reverse, so you are increasing the pH, which means you are decreasing the hydrogen ion concentration. What happens when a person is in alkalosis? You need to decrease the respiratory rate, decrease the depth of breathing. Why? Because you want that hydrogen ion and the CO2 levels to increase. You need to get that pH low. You need to get more hydrogen ions in there. How do you do that? Increase the amount of CO2, which means you decrease the respiratory rate. Now, if there are abnormalities occurring within the respiratory system, somehow the respiratory system is impaired, it can lead to these imbalances of the acid and bases. Hypoventilation can cause respiratory acidosis. Hypoventilation, you're not breathing as fast, therefore you're not getting rid of the CO2, which means you're increasing levels of the hydrogen ions, which means the pH is decreasing and you're leading towards what we call respiratory acidosis. Hyperventilation, that quick breathing, you're getting rid of the CO2 too quickly, which means you're also getting rid of the hydrogen ions, which means the pH is increasing, which means you're leading towards respiratory alkalosis. Now, you can have the chemical buffers that can help try to regulate the pH. But if you have excess acid or excess bases in the body, the chemical buffers aren't going to be able to get rid of it. So now you're going to be able to rely upon the kidneys to help get rid of these excess acids and bases. The lungs can only get rid of the volatile carbonic acid by releasing CO2, but they can't get rid of a non-volatile, say lactic acid, ketones. They can't get rid of that. So the kidneys are going to have to play a role, and they do. Kidneys can help regulate the acid-base balance. They help because they can help regulate or adjust the amount of bicarbonate ions in the blood. They can excrete if there's too much. They can reabsorb if there's not enough. So in the kidneys, it's going to help in the T-tubules. They can't allow the bicarbonate to pass. It's impermeable to it, but it is permeable to carbon dioxide. So it's kind of this two-step process where how does the bicarbonate get entry back into the body? If it's in the urine, well, you convert it back to CO2. The CO2 is able to pass back into the cells, and once it's in the cell, then it can be converted back into bicarbonate. Seems an excessive way, but it works. So this is showing the flow, excuse me, in the kidneys and the transport of CO2 and bicarbonate. Now, when you metabolize food, this can generate more hydrogen ions, and that's going to have to be balanced because you've got to be able to generate more bicarbonate to be able to bind to it. And so there is a process that the body can go through to produce this. In terms of generating new bicarbonate ions, there are some mechanisms within the proximal convoluted tubule in your intercalated cells that will generate new bicarbonate. Once again, it seems like a little bit of an excessive amount, but once again, it does work. For the urine, the most important buffer is going to be the phosphate buffering system. Once again, shown here. And then you do have ammonia excretion. This is very important for excreting acid. And it does help to, if you're excreting acid and excreting ammonia in the urine, helps to, if you're excreting acid, it helps to replenish the alkaline nature of the blood. And once again, this is showing the secretion of ammonia. So when the body's in alkalosis, you need to try to, once again, add more hydrogen ions to the blood to acidify it, bring that pH down, get it back within the proper pH range before you end up in trouble. Now, any imbalance of the acid-base balance is going to be classified as either respiratory or metabolic. So it's basically going to involve either the lungs or the kidneys. Respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, it's a problem with the lungs. Oftentimes, the single most important thing is going to be what is the pressure of the CO2 in the blood. For metabolic, it's going to be typically related to the kidneys that are going to have a problem and have to respond to it. If the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide is above 45 milliliters of mercury, it's respiratory acidosis. Usually it's decrease in ventilation, decrease in gas exchange. That might be due to the individual having pneumonia, maybe emphysema. We also see this with cystic fibrosis. What's going to happen is the carbon dioxide tends to accumulate in the blood and that blood pH drops. With respiratory alkalosis, usually it's due to hyperventilation, which is triggered by either stress or pain. You're eliminating that carbon dioxide faster than what it can be produced. So this table is showing some of the causes and consequences of your acid-base imbalances, so under abnormal conditions, with respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis. Metabolic acidosis, you have low blood pH. Causes oftentimes can be due to ingestion of too much alcohol. Alcohol is converted to acetic acid, and so that's an acid, and that's going to drop the blood pH. It may be due to excessive loss of bicarbonate, and the reason for that could be due to if you have a disease and you're suffering from severe diarrhea. Could also be due to accumulation of lactic acid. This is a problem, a very serious problem that can occur in diabetics sometimes. Can also be seen with starvation or kidney failure. With metabolic alkalosis, you have a rising pH This is not as common. It can be due to excessive vomiting. When you're vomiting, you're getting rid of a lot of acid in the stomach. Another problem can be the ingestion of too much base. And this can be a problem if someone is taking or ingesting too many antacids. So what happens with acidosis and alkalosis, where we're talking about, do the kidneys take over, do the respiratory system take over to try to bring the pH back within the normal balance? What happens? What are side effects? If the blood pH is below 6.8, it can start causing problems with the central nervous system and depression of it. It can lead to coma, it can lead to death. If the blood pH is above 7.8, you have the reverse. Instead of depression of the central nervous system, you have this over stimulus of it, and it can lead to very extreme nervousness, convulsions, muscle tetany, and it can also lead to death. Death is often due to respiratory arrest. Now, if you have an imbalance and the body is picking this up on the acid base, and then if the imbalance is due to malfunction from one of your physiological buffer systems, from the respiratory versus the metabolic, the other one will try to compensate for it. So the respiratory system can try to compensate for problems or malfunctions in the metabolic, and vice versa. The kidneys can try to correct for respiratory imbalances. They cannot compensate within themselves. So the lungs cannot compensate for imbalances due to respiratory problems, but it can try to compensate for metabolic examples. How are the lungs going to compensate? Well, they adjust the respiratory rate. So if you have metabolic acidosis, so you have a decrease in pH, what's going to happen? Well, the respiratory system is going to increase the respiratory rate and the depth of breathing. In metabolic alkalosis, the respiratory system is going to compensate by decreasing the breathing. It's trying to allow the carbon dioxide to accumulate in the blood, which would then ultimately lower the pH. Now, the kidneys try to compensate as well. As I said, if there's a respiratory abnormality or dysfunction, they're going to try to adjust the bicarbonate levels. So in respiratory acidosis, the kidneys are going to try to reabsorb more of the bicarbonate. You may end up seeing hypoventilation causes elevated levels of that pressure, partial pressure of the carbon dioxide. And so you will see adjustment made. And respiratory alkalosis, the kidneys are going to excrete more of the bicarbonate ions. And this table is showing imbalances in that acid-base balance, which ultimately is the pH balance in the blood. For metabolic acidosis, what happens if it's left, well, the numbers for uncompensated, what possible causes of it could be?